Thank you. Thank you very much, Sasha. And I'm very honored to be part of this project with Center for Civil Liberties and many other organizations that are supporting the rule of law and justice in Ukraine. The 17th of July was a very happy day 22 years ago when here in my hometown of Rome, where I'm speaking now from, the Rome Statute was adopted by 120 states voting in favor of it. Today, 22 years after, we have 123 states that are parties to the statute. So it is quite a success that we exceeded even the number of states voting for its adoption. But as we all know, it was, I think, only 6 years ago that on the 17th of July, there was the destruction of the civilian flight Malaysia Airlines 17 over the skies of Ukraine. And this brings us to an understanding of how, unfortunately, crimes against humanity and war crimes are affecting our daily life. Of course, nobody nobody thought that by taking a plane from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, they could have died because a missile was shot by allegedly some rebel organizations in some disputed land, as we say under international law. Of course, we all know that these are organizations supported by the Russian Federation that are bringing an armed conflict into the territory of Ukraine. They were just going on vacation. So this is what it means to be, or they were travel for business, for family reasons. Anyone can be a victim of a crime against humanity. If you are on the wrong place at the wrong time, that was the 17th of July, 2014, I believe, over the skies of Ukraine, you can die out of an attack directed against a civilian object as an aircraft that was flying at that time in that place. So you are simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you can be a victim of crime against humanity just because you belong to humanity. So this is a reminder that we all need to enforce the law so that those who violate it can have consequences from these breaches of the law. This was the rationale of the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute is negotiated and then finally adopted on the 17th of July, 1998, after more than 40 years of negotiations, which started after the Nuremberg trial in 1946. They entailed many, many years of work within the International Law Commission of the United Nations. All this work was frozen in the early 50s due to the Cold War and restarted in 1989 thanks to a resolution that the United Nations General Assembly adopted upon proposal by a member of Parliamentarians for Global Action, Honorable A.N.R. Robinson, who took the role as Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, found an avenue in the agenda of the UNGA of the creation of an international court against drug trafficking and said, let's put it in, send it to the International Law Commission. We, Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean Group, we have a spot there to have a resolution in the Assembly. And then we already know that in 1990, the International Law Commission, made of prominent international law professors and jurists, they will transform that mandate under an international criminal court for any international crime. And as the time evolved and passed, of course, international crime means only genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression, which are the 4 core crimes under international law that were negotiated after Nuremberg in the ILC, in the principles adopted unanimously by the United Nations General Assembly in 1950 as part of customary international law, which are reflected in Article 5 of the Rome Statute. So the Rome Statute is an historic document that on one side codifies customary international criminal law. It also creates and innovates in certain crucial areas, such as the crimes against women, children, and the so-called gender and sexual-based crimes. It also crystallizes all the general principles of law, and in addition, it has a code of international criminal procedure to make sure that proceedings can advance either before an international criminal court or with the cooperation between states and the court itself. The main principle agreed by states in Rome in 1998, which was already agreed the year before in 1997 in the PrepComs in New York, is the principle of complementarity, which governs the relationship between states' exercise of jurisdiction and the residual jurisdiction of the court. The court will only intervene on cases or situations when and if states are either unwilling or unable to genuinely investigate and prosecute. So the court is a sort of entity of last resort that helps states to perform their duties which pre-exist under international law, because all states must prosecute crimes under international law. Any international document, such as, for example, the Minsk agreement for a peaceful settlement of the situation between Russia and Ukraine, cannot violate international law. And under international law, you cannot have amnesties for the most serious crimes of concern to the international community as a whole. So while the amnesty is incentivized, for example, by the Geneva Conventions for the breaches of the Geneva Conventions, is not allowed for the grave breaches, war crimes under the Geneva Convention. A fortiori, such amnesty are unlawful for genocidal crimes against humanity. The debate on the crime of aggression is, of course, open, as this is a crime sui generis. So one has to understand the Rome Statute as crystallizing, codifying, putting in a written document customary law. It's largely a codification of pre-existing customary law with some significant innovations. And it does only restate what states failed to do until 1998. Remember, the Genocide Convention, for example, is adopted in 1948. Everybody agrees, most states of the world are parties to it, yet the first person ever adjudicated on the crime of genocide is Mr. Akayesu, the mayor of the city of Taba, who gets convicted for genocide in the year 1998. So 40 years after the Genocide Convention was adopted by the ad hoc International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, because in the 1990s, in the midst before the restart of the process of creation of a permanent court and the setting up of the court, which will only enter into force on the 1st of July 2002, we have the Security Council creating 2 ad hoc tribunals. We have certain states like Sierra Leone entering into bilateral agreements with the Security Council for the setting up of special courts, like the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and other entities similarly constituted as hybrid or internationalized domestic tribunals that start developing a certain jurisprudence on these international crimes, which in the end is also finally helping states to understand that they have to fight impunity for these crimes. The only big body of law that we had on the fight against impunity stems from Nazi crimes and the great efforts to end impunity for Nazi war criminals, separate from, of course, the Nuremberg Tribunal and also the Tokyo tribunals for the persons most responsible of the crimes committed by the Axis during World War II. What we have today is a system of permanent justice that can apply in theory universally. In practice, we see that that's not the case, but in theory, universally international criminal law. Yet, for the system to work and for complementarity to really be a stimulus for states to end impunity for international crimes, states must join the ICC. Because if they don't join, the ICC cannot exercise automatically its territorial or active personality jurisdiction, based either on the territory of the state who accepted the jurisdiction of the court, or on the nationality of the perpetrator of the country that has accepted the jurisdiction of the court, which is done for good only through means of ratification. So far, Ukraine has accepted the jurisdiction of the court ad hoc, only in respect of a given situation initially, and then moving forward for all the alleged possible crimes committed in its territories, but without being a state party. So while Ukraine today has a duty to cooperate with the court, it doesn't enjoy the right that any state party may have. And I would say it doesn't also have the leverage that state parties have, because state parties, they vote for the budget of the court, they oversight the functioning of the court, they set up independent review mechanism, as they are doing now, for a process of reforming the court, making it more effective and efficient, and so on and so forth. They elect a new prosecutor, the state parties. Ukraine, unless it ratifies by September, won't be able to be part of the group of states that will elect the new prosecutor, which is quite a loss, because we know how important prosecutorial choices, exercise of the prosecutorial discretion and the due diligence, how important it is for the selection of certain situations versus others, for prioritization of certain cases versus others. So the election of the new prosecutor, I would say, it's the most important challenge and opportunity that the Rome Statute system has. In the end of, in December 2020, we will have the Assembly of State Party that will take that important decision. So the Rome Statute is created as a guarantee, as an insurance policy for every state, to make sure that when states are failing, because maybe there is a coup d'etat, there is a new oppressive regime that destroys the fundamental human rights of its own people. Look at what has been happening in the Philippines with the Duterte administration, an administration that embraced a public policy of assassination, of killing of anyone engaged or involved in so-called drug dealings, which includes a lot of civilians. So it has been estimated that several thousand civilians have been killed by death squads sponsored by the police or other forces under the Duterte policy, Duterte being the head of state, the president of the Philippines, to carry out a cleaning of the streets in many big cities of those involved in the consumption or in the selling of these illegal drugs. Well, this is a crime against humanity if it's a widespread or systematic attack directed against the civilian population. And the previous democratic government of Philippines agreed to ratify the Rome Statute in 2011. And now the court, notwithstanding the unilateral decision of Mr. Duterte to remove Philippines from the state parties through an act of withdrawal, they still retain the jurisdiction over the first phase of the war on drugs until the time that the withdrawal took off 1 year after the deposit of the withdrawal. So the system is a guarantee, an insurance that there won't be impunity, because as long as a person like Duterte will be in power, there is a guarantee of impunity for his death squads, and of course for himself, being probably the highest perpetrator of these criminal transactions. Yet there is a court in The Hague that is looking into this, is conducting an analysis, and hopefully very soon a fully fledged investigation, and hopefully very soon, and we don't know, maybe they are sealed or secret, some arrest warrants directed against those engaged in these criminal acts. So by joining the Rome Statute and not ad hoc selecting one situation versus another, a state exercises its sovereignty by guaranteeing its own population against the commission of the most serious crimes of international concern, like extermination under crimes against humanity, like enslavement, like apartheid, like other things that can happen when there is a change of government and an entire category of people gets discriminated against, gets persecuted, gets forcibly removed from the territory, gets becomes the target of crimes against humanity, or if there is an armed conflict, war crimes, or even a genocidal plan to destroy as a whole or in part group. And the case of Ukraine is paradigmatic, because Ukraine, it's the first ever country in the history of modern international law, which starts in 1945 with the adoption of the UN Charter, in which a permanent member of the Security Council with a veto power, the Russian Federation, is calling for the annexation of a territory belonging to a sovereign state. I'm referring to the Crimea. Such annexation is not only unlawful under international law, is null and void. So anything that is being done by the Russian Federation on territory of Ukraine is illegal and should not have any legal consequences. Any person who became Russian while he's Ukrainian is still Ukrainian under international law and should be treated as such. But such an act may also fulfill the requirements of the crime of aggression, which entered into force on the 17th of July of 2018, 2 years ago. So we have now the ability to prosecute the crime of aggression with a lot of limitations. So this, as it is configured now in the Rome Statute, may not be sufficient to trigger the jurisdiction of the court, even if Ukraine ratifies, because it has a very cumbersome system for also the need of the state of the nationality of the perpetrator to join in and accept the jurisdiction. Nevertheless, while the persons most responsible for the crimes in Crimea and in the Donbass occupied territory can be prosecuted for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even if it would happen, genocide, under the Rome Statute and the ICC, I would argue that Ukraine as a state party could make a very strong case for the domestic prosecution of the crime of aggression committed in Crimea, and also make representations in front of the court so that the court, in other cases that it may develop in the future, could consider that the crimes committed, like during the unlawful occupation of most of Europe by the Nazi troops during World War II, when the occupiers commit such atrocious crimes as war crimes and crimes against humanity, if it's also conducting an unlawful aggression, that is to be considered, at least for the highest level of the chain of command, an aggravating factor for the determination of the penalty against the alleged perpetrator. So these are all very important legal arguments, but I would say also these are also extremely important political arguments, because unfortunately, and this is the reality in which we live, we know all very well that there is no military solution to the ongoing conflict. Why? Because Ukraine respected international law and was abiding to the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. And under the law, Ukraine devolved and eliminated all its nuclear arsenal, which in 1994 was the third largest nuclear arsenal of the world, and allowed, in exchange of the respect of its sovereign integrity and independence, the Russian Federation to take over. Now, what is the consequence of that breach of international law? There is a lot of political support. There is a declaration of illegality of what has been happening so far. There is strong solidarity by the European Union and other entities with Ukraine. But what we need now is also legal consequences. And in my position, also as a public international law, I do believe that the enforcement opportunity that the Rome Statute system gives us is uniquely important, because those who are at the top of the chain of command, they are very concerned to become indicted war criminals. Look at the president of Mr. Omar al-Bashir, who was indicted for the most serious crimes of international concern for many years, over 10 years, and step by step, his powers became weaker, and in the end, its own people, the people of Sudan, decided to remove him from power, and he has been under arrest, and now he's under also prosecution for some very serious ordinary crimes. So, to cut a long story short, the nightmare of leaders like Mr. Putin and others is to end up being indicted by an international court, because that will irremediably stain their reputation, their ability to conduct international relations. So I do believe that since there is no military solution to the ongoing problem, there has to be a legal solution that in the mid-long term will restore full legality and sovereignty of the people of Ukraine on its own territory. So I would say that it would be very important as the next step in 2020, before the next Assembly of State Parties, for Ukraine to join the Rome Statute system. I would stop here because I think I may have used more of the time that was allocated to me. I would be happy to take questions or comments. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just the first question. I just want to end to me. For me, I mean that if as you know, that Roma Statute, it's not so easy for using it for example, in our conflict between Ukraine and Russia, because Russia don't accept it, and more decision in their level, like constitutional court or something, this trying to protect themselves from such broken of the rules of international humanitarian law. What do you think about how criminal court can answer for this challenge, for such movement?
Yeah. Sasha, this is nothing new.
Yeah.
When Pinochet was a dictator and violating international law and committing crimes against humanity, he wouldn't recognize any international authority. Even when he left power for many years, he had impunity. But at a certain point in time, when there was an exercise of jurisdiction, at that time on the basis of certain criteria of jurisdiction allowed under Spanish law, UK law, international treaty law, the Convention Against Torture, and so on, suddenly things changed. And when he went back to Chile, trial started, immunity was removed. Similarly, you know, one of the main concerns of some people around Adolf Hitler was what will happen if the international community will go against us and they will prosecute us. And there is a record of a meeting with the Führer and the Nazis at that time from documents that have been published relating to meetings in the early days, 1933, 1934. And the Führer apparently said, who remembers about the Armenians, making reference to the massacres, now we would call them genocide, of the Armenians in 1915 by the Ottoman Empire, and the absolute impunity that they had through an amnesty, through the second peace treaty that replaced the initial one with accountability provisions after World War I. So what I'm trying to say here is that we need to look at this process not for what will happen tomorrow or after tomorrow. We need to think of ourselves in the next 5, 10, 15, and 20 years, and we need to look at the rights of the future generations. The future generations of Ukrainians, of Russians, of Europeans, of people of the world have the right to live in a peaceful world based on justice, not on aggressive wars and mass atrocities. So it's for that purpose that we need to fight for Ukraine and every other state, including Russia one day, to join the Rome Statute, so that we have a guarantee of against impunity for all. Now, they are very nervous about what can happen in respect of the Georgian case, 2008, or in respect of the Ukrainian case. They are even more nervous if one day the court will have jurisdiction over Syria, where 68,000 troops on the ground committed the most serious atrocities known to humankind. These are Russian nationals on the ground from Latakia, Syria, throughout Aleppo and the entire country for years and years of siege, starvation, mass murder, bombardment of civilian objects, and so on. They are terrorized. If there is one thing that they don't want, is Ukraine or other states to give jurisdiction to the court to enter into businesses that they consider of their own strategic interest. It's not in the strategic interest of humankind, so we need to perseverate and continue with all the limits that there are, but we need to look at the long term, not at tomorrow or after tomorrow. And in the long term, even the Russian Federation, who, by the way, remember this, on the 17th of July, 1998, Russian Federation was one of the P3 with France and the UK to vote in favor of the adoption of the Rome Statute. So they can go back to their original position, revisit these years of nationalism and imperialism that they have tried to revisit, and go back into an idea of being united in Europe in a much more prosperous and decent future for their own people. So, and for the peoples of the entire continent and of the entire planet. So I am very optimistic in this, but we need to give the good example and move forward without waiting for the big powers. The big powers will come, because if they want peace, justice, the rule of law, and human rights, they will have to come. Those who will not want to come, it means they will pose themselves outside of international law protection, and in the long term, they will have very serious consequences.